We're here with author Victor Davis Hanson at the Tikvah Fund Conservatism Conference here in Jerusalem. Tell me a little bit about what you see and if it encourages you.
Well, conservatism isn't a word that we automatically identify with the domestic politics of Israel, but what seems to be interesting is that aside from foreign policy, that there's the conservative impulse seems to be taking hold in Israel. And you can really see, I was here twice, but it's for a visitor who sees the skyline and the bustle, you can see the principles of conservatism have really transformed Israel, it seems like, in terms of wealth and productivity and labor.
But perhaps in the past, capitalism, conservatism was more of belonged really more to the elite classes.
It was.
And now we're seeing a sort of reversal where the elite classes in democracies such as the United States and Israel are turning more progressive, but yet you have an underbelly from the public that is returning to conservative ideology. Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is that the traditional industries in which one became wealthy, at least in the United States, were things that were physical. Timber, real estate, agriculture, farming, transportation. While they're still there, the more abstract, high-tech, insurance, finance was where the real global money was. Those were areas that the 7 billion person plus global market enriched people. And so they then became disconnected from reality, and they sort of virtue signaled their empathy without any consequences of their own personal behavior. But other people that were upwardly mobile were still connected by their livelihood to reality. Electricians, carpenters, long-haul truck drivers, farmers, all of these people were the beneficiaries of a move toward freer markets, but they were grounded in reality, and so they understood that you don't take chances with food or with shelter or with fuel, that these are the building blocks of the society. Whereas if you're very, very wealthy and you're insulated, then you don't really care if diesel fuel is $10 a gallon or $8. That falls on somebody else. So they're always subject to the consequences of their ideology in a way that the new elite is not.
We're obviously facing a lot of challenges in the United States and in Israel. Do you have a hope that Israel is somehow on a stronger trajectory than the state of Israel, and what underlying themes would give you that sense?
Well, when you look at Israel in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you felt that in a variety of sectors it was vulnerable or dependent on others for oil, for natural gas, for some of their weaponry, for many of their defense needs. And now what you're seeing is that in terms of energy development, that Israel is not only independent but perhaps an exporter in high-tech weaponry that's essential to its survival. It's autonomous in that. In fact, it exports that expertise. And while it still has its good relations with the United States, it understands that as a powerful country that it is developing relations of realism with China, India, Russia, all other countries in the world that makes it not so dependent upon the United States in particular, given our volatile politics. And then when you look at home at Israel, it seems to me that there's a vibrancy here that we don't have in the United States. And our biggest bane is this wokeism, mandatory equality result, and virtue signaling among the elite. And while it's evident in every Western society, the unique landscape of where Israel is located makes that a dessert or an option that they don't really have to taste because they have no margin of error, given the existential nature of Israeli security.
And where do you think you see the gap between Israel and the United States over the next several years headed?
Well, progressivism in the United States is by nature antithetical to Israel. And Israel, unfortunately, has been constructed by the American left as a representative of white privilege or white success or white exploitation of indigenous peoples, i.e. the Palestinians. And that has been in power the 8 years of the Obama administration now for it'll be 4 years of the Biden. And I think, unfortunately, to Israel, that comes as a shock because it seems bewildering given its origins and the crisis that it survived, the idea that it's an overdog or that it's an exploiter. So I think in the United States, if that progressive movement were to continue, then I don't think that we would be a reliable ally to Israel. I don't think it is going to continue. I think there's going to be a big correction in November. And I think when you look at polls still, despite the propaganda of our media, about 65% of the American people continue to poll their support for Israel. But that's not reflected in Democratic politics. The far left has sort of hijacked the control of the Democratic Party, and Israel's got to be aware of that.
And how important an ally do you think it is for Israel to be a powerful ally to the United States?
To be an ally of the United States?
Yeah, how important is Israel as an ally to the United States?
Well, it's a mutual beneficiary relationship, mutually beneficial, because in terms of military development, we learn from each other. We learn technological, we learn operational expertise back and forth. So many Israelis and Americans have dual citizenship. It's the only Western democracy. I could go on and on forever. So there's a natural affinity that explains the political alliances rather than vice versa. So that's not going to change, and that's important. But we're reaching a crisis now with the dissemination of very dangerous weapons, and given the extremism of Israel's allies, we're going to reach a point within the next 10 years that a nuclear Iran is going to have to be dealt with. And that process of dealing with Iran is going to be transnational, unfortunately. In other words, there's going to be players in that matrix like Russia and China that will be guarantors of Iranian proliferation and maybe even strategic options that will require some type of balance. So I think it's essential for Israel and the United States to maintain this critical relationship as things become very dangerously complex in the next decade.
Victor Davis Hanson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.